Hello, I am Andres Sibbles and have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of the USDA Climate Hubs and the Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network, I'd like to welcome you to the second presentation in this series of 11 webinars focused on grazing land management and soil carbon. The goal of this series is to provide an update on the knowns and unknowns about the influence of management on soil carbon dynamics in grazing lands of the continental United States. Today's presentation will be followed by a short question and answer session. Please type your questions for the speaker in the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen at any time during or after the presentation. Today's webinar will conclude promptly at 45 minutes past the hour. The title of today's presentation is Grazing has a Neutral or Positive Effect on Soil Carbon in Florida Pastures. Today's speaker is Dr. Betsey Boughton, the Director of Agroecology and a Senior Research Biologist at Archbold Biological Station's Buck Island Ranch, a commercial cattle ranch in Lake Placid, Florida. In her current position since 2011, her research focuses on the environmental and economic sustainability of grazing lands in the headwaters of the Everglades and seeks to sustain biodiversity and ecosystem services in agroecosystems. Dr. Boughton is the site leader of the Archbold University of Florida LTAR site and co-leads the LTAR Grazing Lands Working Group. So, Dr. Boughton, you are up next.
Thanks to everyone for joining today. I'd like to thank the organizers for putting together this webinar series and for the opportunity to speak today and showcase our work in Florida. I'm a research ecologist and I work on a cattle ranch in Florida, and many people ask me how cattle grazing affect the environment, and often a major assumption is that cattle mostly degrade the environment. But we found that the impacts of cattle grazing depend on how they're managed, and they can have neutral or positive effects depending on the situation. So today I'm going to talk about our work focused on soil carbon in Florida pastures. So soil carbon is a really interesting subject, and people that manage lands have been interested in it for a really long time, since the early 1900s, even before that, because of its link to soil health and stability. And in the last few decades, carbon sequestration to mitigate climate change has been seen as an important opportunity. Grazing lands occupy about a quarter of the global land surface, and that's a really large area. So soil carbon sequestration on grazing lands is an opportunity for offsetting carbon emissions and removal of carbon dioxide from the air because they are such a large area. Improved grazing management has a high potential for climate mitigation because it's scalable across that large area of land surface, and it's low cost, and we have a lot of knowledge built up over decades on the role of grazing management on soil health. It also has benefits to producers at the ranch scale. So soil carbon can increase water holding capacity, soil moisture. That could lead to increases in forage quantity and forage accumulation. And it can also benefit grassland resilience and help buffer against extreme weather events. So I first wanted to just talk about the basics of soil carbon sequestration. So put simply, carbon inputs have to be greater than carbon outputs to achieve soil carbon sequestration. And the main way that carbon gets into the soil is through plants and photosynthesis. And you'll hear me talk a lot about productivity. And when I say productivity, I'm meaning the amount of vegetation growth in an area over a period of time. So plants take up carbon dioxide from the air to grow, and they move it below ground to the plant roots. Carbon outputs can occur through several ways. One way is decomposition and through microbial respiration. but the main point is that carbon inputs have to exceed carbon outputs for carbon sequestration to occur. So to understand how grazing affects soil carbon sequestration, we have to understand all the different pathways that grazing can alter carbon inputs and outputs to a grassland. So I'll walk you through this diagram. At the bottom, you can see the carbon inputs minus the carbon outputs leads to the soil carbon stock, or the mass of carbon per unit area. And cattle grazing can affect the carbon sequestration in 4 main pathways. Biotic pathways refers to how grazing can alter vegetation productivity, canopy cover, diversity, tissue quality, root growth, and microbial growth. The deposition pathway is through cattle excrement that can increase nitrogen availability, that can in turn affect productivity, maybe increase it, so greater carbon inputs. It can also affect the soil physical properties through soil exposure and compaction. So if more soil is exposed to sunlight, temperatures could increase, then that may increase decomposition, also could increase erosion potential, and the soil compaction is due to how grazing hoof action can compact the soil that at high levels could reduce root growth, soil moisture, and productivity. So one of the things I'm going to talk about today is grazing exclusion, and that means removing cattle grazing from an area. And this is one of the first steps to understanding how grazing affects soil carbon in many systems to compare grazed versus ungrazed. And this is often relevant in easement programs. So some conservation easements may or may not allow grazing. And this is relevant in Florida, where easements are an important conservation tool. So we have easements on our ranch through the NRCS Conservation Easements Program, wetland reserve easements, and we have to apply for compatible use permits to allow grazing on these lands. And some agencies have considered grazing removal as a potential best management practice. So data that we have comparing grazed versus ungrazed systems is really important for informing those type of management decisions. And the thing I'm going to talk a lot about today is the use of grazing exclosures. And in this photo, you can see a small fenced area. This is on the ranch where I work, and these exclosures are 10 meter by 10 meter. And you can see they're just an area, a small fenced area where we've excluded cattle, and there's grazing all around it, so we can compare grazed versus ungrazed. And the situations I'm talking about today are grazing exclusion on formerly grazed areas. So this study took place at the Archbold Biological Station, University of Florida Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network site, or LTAR. And we are part of the LTAR network that is funded by the USDA, and it's a network of 19 sites that are focused on informing sustainable agriculture. And our site is located in Central Florida. Our Archbold Biological Station is a nonprofit research, conservation, and education organization, and we are partnered with University of Florida to represent subtropical humid grazing lands in the LTAR network. So many people are surprised to hear that Florida is a cattle state. They think of beaches or Disney or a lot of other things. But Florida's beef industry is large, and it's almost exclusively cow-calf. The state is home to 4 of the 10 largest cow-calf operations in the U.S. 1/5 of the state of Florida is ranch land, and our state contains about 900,000 beef cows. So in this map here, I've shaded all of the counties in Florida in different shades of gray. and the darker areas represent high density of beef cattle. So our LTAR sites, Archbold Biological Station, Archbold's Buck Island Ranch, and the UF Range Cattle Research and Education Center is located in this area of dense cattle. And we're in the heart of Florida grazing lands with nearly 80% of Florida's cow-calf production within a 150-mile radius. So I'm based at Archbold's Buck Island Ranch. This is just one part of Archbold, and if you want to learn more, I encourage you to go to our website here. Buck Island Ranch is a typical Florida cattle ranch. It's one of the top 20 ranches in Florida. It's a 10,500 acre property with 3,000 cattle. And we use this ranch as a platform for our long-term ecological research on water, biodiversity, and carbon. And we focus a lot on environmental and economic sustainability questions. And our work quantifies many of the important conservation values that ranches provide to maintain sustainability in Florida. So as I said, Buck Island Ranch is a typical ranch. Most ranches in Florida have at least 2 different pasture types. We have cultivated Bahia grass pastures, and that's shown in orange here on the map. And Bahia grass pastures have a relatively high stocking rate. We're stocked at 1 to 3 acres per cow-calf pair. These cultivated pastures are fertilized occasionally with nitrogen and potassium. We haven't fertilized with phosphorus since 1986. They are planted with this forage grass called Bahia grass, and this is a grass originally from South America, and it has relatively good forage quality, and it's very tolerant to wet and dry conditions, so it's really ideal for Florida conditions. Our soils are sandy and acidic, and we do have ditching across the ranch to drain the land in the wet season and irrigate in the dry season. We also have semi-native pastures, and that's shown in green on this map. And we use these semi-native areas for a standing hay crop mostly in the dry winter season. So these areas are a mixture of Bahia grass and native bunch grasses, and they support 5 to 15 acres per cow-calf pair. They have no history of fertilization, and they only have small amounts of plantings and small ditching amounts. And so this is very typical of a Florida ranch, that they would have these 2 pasture types. And then the blue that you see on the ranch are all the seasonal wetlands that are wet in the wet season and dried down in the dry season, and we have over 600 of these. I just wanted to point out that these cultivated Bahia grass pastures are really large land use in the southeastern U.S., about 4 million acres shown here in green. So the work that we're doing on these cultivated pastures is potentially relevant to a large area. So now getting into a little bit of the methods of this study to answer the question, how does long-term grazing exclusion affect soil carbon? And to do this, we set up many exclosures across the ranch, and I have to give a shout out to Patrick Bolin for doing this in the early 2000s. So he set up 5 10-meter by 10-meter exclosures in the cultivated pastures in 2002, and in 2005 he set up 19 of them in the semi-native pastures. And we've had a series of students, graduate students, that have worked in these areas. Julia Mackey and Chris Wilson worked on soil carbon in the cultivated Bahia grass pastures, and there they used 3 exclosures and 3 paired graze plots, and they sampled in 2017, so that was at 15 years of grazing exclusion. And semi-native pastures, my research intern at the time, Caroline Wade, did work to sample the soil carbon in the semi-native pasture exclosures and grazed paired plots. And so that was 15 years of grazing exclusion there. And in both studies, soils were sampled to 5 centimeters in depth and then also to 30 centimeters. And we also measured other measurements like bulk density, which is a measure of soil compaction, vegetation cover and diversity and composition, root biomass, and microbial biomass. So here's a few photographs showing the exclosures and graze plots over time. You can see I've got a series of photographs from 2003, 2006, and then 2014 and 2024. So in 2003, that was just 1 year after grazing exclusion, and the plant communities are very similar, very grass dominated. And in 2006, we started to note that woody invasion was occurring and more forbs were starting to dominate. And in 2014, here's one of the exclosures you can just see is like really covered by shrubs. So over time, we were able to show that the grazed plots remain dominated by bahia grass, while in the exclosures, bahia grass dropped from 86% to 29% cover on average, and shrubs increased over time. And they're variable, but on average over the 3 exclosures, it was 33% cover of shrubs. And here's some exclosures of looking at what the semi-native pastures look like. So vegetation change is much more subtle in those areas. And in these pictures taken in July 2024, so that's like 19 years of grazing exclusion. The grazed areas, you can tell they have more grass dominance. There's definitely more forbs in the ungrazed exclosures. And we did note significant vegetation changes. And we saw more woody plants and forbs, while the grazed areas remained grass dominated. And these DOIs that I show on the slides, they are publications that go into more detail on these results. If interested, you can look at them. Okay, so the first 3 slides, I'm going to talk about the data from the bahia grass pastures, and these are all 15 years of grazing exclusion. On this graph, we have grazed and exclosure on the x-axis, and then grams per meter square on the y-axis. And this graph is showing grass biomass in red and root biomass in orange. And what we found was that in exclosures, the above ground biomass, the grass biomass, was twice as large as it was in the grazed areas. But root biomass was 74% lower in the exclosures. And it was quite impressive just to see how much more root biomass that the grazed plots had compared to the exclosure plots. So here I'm showing microbial biomass in blue and soil carbon concentration in green. And so on the left, again, these graphs have grazed versus exclosure plots. Microbial biomass was 79% greater in grazed plots, and soil carbon concentration was 24% greater in the grazed plots. Now moving on to the semi-native pasture results. Again, this is 15 years of grazing exclusion, and we have grazed and exclosure on the x-axis and grams per meter square on the y. Here, the orange bar is litter biomass, which is a measure of the vegetation amount there, and it was equivalent in grazed and exclosure plots. But for root biomass, we observed 17% higher root biomass in the ungrazed plots. So here is semi-native pasture data on bulk density, which is a physical property of soil that refers to how dense it is. And we found higher bulk density in the grazed plots versus the exclosure. and the soil carbon percentage was equal. But when we took into account the amount of soil carbon per unit area, we found that the total soil carbon stocks were greater in the grazed areas versus the exclosures in semi-native pastures. So grazed areas had 27% greater carbon mass. So if we kind of like put this together in a summary table, overall we find that grazing exclusion reduced carbon stocks in the top layer of the soil, and it was a change of about 7.6 megagrams of carbon per hectare in semi-native pastures, 7.6 megagrams per hectare more in the grazed soil, and in the Bahia grass cultivated pastures, 8.8 megagrams carbon per hectare more in the grazed soil versus exclosure. So in conclusion, grazing exclusion, that's removing cows from formerly grazed pastures, causes soil carbon to be lost from cultivated Bahia grass pastures. We also saw that plant communities changed with grazing exclusion. Exclosures had more woody species, forbs, and less grasses. So we can conclude from that that the typical grazing management that we employ maintains the carbon stocks and grassland habitat in our pastures. So what does typical grazing management mean? It means moderate stocking rate, utilizing rotational stocking, and when we look at utilization, it's about 30 to 40% of the annual productivity. In the semi-native pastures, we typically use mob grazing in the dry season, and then they're not grazed for the rest of the year. So it was interesting to see that the drivers of the carbon stocks differed between the two pasture types. So root biomass and microbial biomass are really important for soil carbon in the cultivated Bahia grass pastures, while it looks like soil physical properties were a driver in semi-native pastures. So today I talked a lot about comparisons of grazed pastures versus grazing exclusion, and it is a good first step, especially because some ranch land conservation easement programs consider removal of grazing. However, we need more work on how grazing affects soil carbon. So the stocking method that's used and the grazing intensity would be really important information to have. We also do a lot of other ranch management practices on our ranch, including prescribed fire, wetland restoration, mechanical treatments. So knowing how all of these ranch management practices affect soil carbon and the drivers of soil carbon will be important for designing management to optimize soil carbon. And lastly, there's a need for technology or tools that allow us to measure soil carbon at relevant large scales. Grazing lands are very heterogeneous landscapes, and it's very labor intensive to measure soil carbon and get a good representative measure of soil carbon stock in these grazing lands. So remote sensing tools that allow us to measure the effects of the soil carbon and the management on soil carbon would be key to optimizing management for soil carbon. And with that, I'd like to conclude and acknowledge my study co-authors and our ranch manager and ranch operations crew, Archbold Biological Station and Buck Island Ranch, and the funding and partners that we've had over the years to support our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Betsy. We have a number of questions coming in, and so I will read a few of these. I think we have time for several. Can you describe the ranch's typical stocking management during the last few decades?
Yes, we use rotational stocking. So our ranch manager uses vegetation cues to decide when to move cattle out of a pasture or into a pasture. Um, Typically, that's like a vegetation height or a stubble height. And so we don't use continuous stocking. In the growing season on cultivated pastures, it's probably 21 days on and then like 60 days rest on average. And in the semi-native pastures, we also use rotational stocking. It's not like an intensive rotation. It's just where you put a lot of cattle. We do have the stocking rates of like 3 acres per cow in cultivated pastures and 5 to 10 acres per cow in semi-native.
Thank you, Betsy. We have another question here about bulk density. And so the question goes, how do you take into account the difference in bulk density between grazed and ungrazed when calculating carbon stock for a given depth?
That's a very good question. And one thing I didn't point out when I gave the presentation is that in the cultivated Bahia grass pastures, we didn't see a significant difference in bulk density between the grazed and the exclosure plots. In the semi-native pastures, we did detect a significant difference where we had greater bulk density in grazed areas. And because of this, then there's this other method called the equivalent soil mass method that will attempt to account for those differences in bulk density. And instead of taking the mass per volume of soil, it's like looking at on an equivalent mass basis, what is the soil carbon in that equivalent mass? So we attempted to do that in the semi-native pastures, and we still found greater soil carbon in the grazed areas.
Thank you, Betsy. We have another question here. Why does Bahia grass sequester more carbon than native pasture?
We think it has to do with the different traits of the species. So Bahia grass has a really extremely large root system, and it's a spreading turf forming grass, whereas the native plants that we have are a lot of them are bunch grasses. So it may be due to those traits of the species and the different amounts of root growth and how the species are responding to grazing. But I think that would be a good area to research further. It may also have to do with the microbial aspects of the roots encouraging microbial growth, because I do know Bahia grass has a lot of carbon exudates that it releases, and it stimulates a lot of microbial growth.
Thank you. We have another question that goes, if woody species and forbs were treated mechanically or with herbicides in the exclusion area, would you expect an increase in soil carbon sequestration similar to the grazed areas?
I'm not sure. That's a good question. I think when you mechanically treat soil, you could be disturbing that soil, and that could increase decomposition. So you have to be careful of that. But if we can maintain Bahia grass, like the grass coverage and the grass dominance in plots, it might be the same, but I'm not sure, because I think that the very process of grazing, where cattle are removing the plant above ground parts,
stimulates plants some plants to invest in roots. So I'm not sure that mechanical or herbicide would have the same effect. One thing to note is that we do use prescribed fire, and these exclosures did have fire go through them. So we had, when we burn a pasture, we don't protect those exclosures from being burned. So those exclosures did have fire every few years, but you still see that woody growth. So I thought that was interesting that fire alone did not keep out the woody encroachment in those exclosures.
Thank you. That perhaps answers the next question, unless the question is about fire. And have you had a chance to look at effects of fire on grazed and ungrazed? And if there's anything else you'd like to say about fire, Betsey? If not, we can move on to another.
Well, we did another study in wetlands where we had wetlands that we fenced and excluded cattle from versus grazed wetlands, and we had fire as a treatment. So we had fire interacting with grazing in the wetlands, and we didn't see a huge effect of fire, but we did detect there was like this weak effect where fire might make the soil carbon more recalcitrant or more stable. So I think that would be interesting to look into in the future, is the fire effect on soil carbon, because there's some evidence that it may change carbon forms.
Thank you. Another question here. Do you have data showing the overall net reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by doing rotational grazing, pasture plus soil plus animal emissions? I've visited the Buck Island Station and it's a great place, says this.
Yes, you might have heard me talk about, or us talk about it before. We are very interested in our net carbon balance, and we have eddy covariance towers on the ranch that we are working with University of Illinois and Texas A&M and Cornell to look at the net carbon uptake. And we've also combined the data with life cycle analysis to look at the emissions from our operation. And we did a recent modeling effort with our partners at Alltech, and we did find that the ranch is a net carbon sink. That is the preliminary result, that it looks like the carbon uptake offsets our emissions, which is really interesting. And the LTAR network is, we're working on this across the LTAR grazing lands to do a similar net ecosystem. We call it net ecosystem carbon balance, where we look at all the inputs and the outputs and try to find out if we're a net carbon sink.
There's a somewhat related question about models, and it goes, are there any validated models for carbon in grazing systems?
That's very challenging. The model that we used was with the University of Illinois, the EcoSys model. And this model combines remote sensing data. It used our eddy covariance tower data to look at like validating the model. And we also put our soil data into it and our groundwater table data. So the model had to take a lot of our on-site data to be accurate. So there's not like a ready-made model that can be applied anywhere. It takes a lot of data from the site to calibrate these models.
There's a follow-up question here to your previous answer, and it says, does the net carbon sink modeling include enteric emissions?
Yes, it does. Enteric emissions is probably 50% of our emissions. Another 20% from manure emissions. But another big emission source from our ranch is the ecosystem methane, because we have all those wetlands and the groundwater table that comes to the surface in the summer wet season. So when the soils are saturated and wet, we're getting a lot of ecosystem methane. So the three biggest sources are the cattle, the ecosystem methane, and the manure emissions. And actually, in one study we did, we found that cattle emissions, the enteric fermentation was only 19 to 30% of our methane emissions, and most of it was coming from the ecosystem. And that's not to say that wetlands are bad or that we should drain wetlands or anything, but that's a natural source of methane on our ranch.
Thank you. There is a question here about nutrient content, biomass, and carbon, and it goes like this. Did you look at overall nutrient content of the biomass as well as primary productivity and carbon in the grazed versus exclosure plots?
No, we didn't. So I would love to, the driver's diagram that I showed in the beginning of the talk, I would love to like measure every one of those things and then look at like a path analysis or something to see which driver, what is the relative importance of these drivers. I still think there's a lot of work that can be done in this type of exclosure infrastructure that we have, and there's remaining questions to ask. So I think that's a good question, because the grazing can change the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus ratios in plant tissue, and that could affect the microbes and the decomposition and how that plant tissue gets converted to organic matter.
Excellent. We probably have a few more minutes for questions if you're still okay, Betsy.
Yeah, sure. These are good questions. I don't know the answers to all of them, but we'll try.
That's excellent. One question back to bulk density and carbon says, did you find differences in carbon or bulk density by soil series or ecological site?
So in our study, we worked in similar soil series. So these are the same soil types, and we wanted to do that to control for soil type. But I do think that these relationships could vary based on the soil type and where you're doing the study. So I think that's a really important factor to control for in studies like this. I do know that on our ranch, we have two main soil types, the sandy soils and the very more organic muck type soils. And the organic mucks have a lot more carbon in them. But we worked in the sandier soil types.
Another related question is, were there any measurements of soil carbon at varying depths? If so, what results did you get?
Yes, we did go down to 30 centimeters, and the only place we detected significant results was in the top 5 centimeters. So when we looked at 5 to 15 and then 15 to 30, we didn't see any differences between grazed and exclosure plots. So I think like the top part of the soil is more it's more affected by changes in management.
I think we can probably squeeze a couple more in here. Do you think that grazing intensity goes this question? Do you think the grazing intensity of a semi-native pasture carbon gains can outweigh emissions, I guess?
We had a study that showed that they do. So we had another study where we had eddy covariance towers measuring carbon dioxide and methane in grazed and ungrazed semi-native pastures. And we found that grazed areas were a greater carbon sink, even after accounting for the enteric methane from cattle. And one of the reasons for that was because in the ungrazed areas, a lot of the plant biomass built up as litter. And so the respiration from the ungrazed system was much higher. And it also starts to block out photosynthesis because you get so much dead building up. In the grazed system, the cattle are removing biomass by grazing, so that litter layer doesn't build up as much, and you still have a lot of green plant tissue. And then another thing is that the grazing actually increases soil moisture because you have less evapotranspiration, so you get a little bit more ecosystem methane in the grazed areas. But after accounting for all of that, the grazed semi-native pasture was a greater carbon sink than the ungrazed.
Thank you, Betsy. The last question, this one is a bit further away, but how would you assess the potential / value of carbon incentive payment contracts on grazing lands?
We've been thinking about that question a lot. It's really important to have credibility in those carbon payment programs. So one of the key things for that is additionality. And typically those payment programs aren't going to pay for anything you're existing like that you're doing. So any type of carbon market payment should come from an additional benefit. So something like increasing your carbon uptake or reducing your emissions that you weren't already doing before. So that's really important. I see our work here as creating a baseline, saying this is our baseline carbon uptake and our emissions. And now if we did an intervention to reduce those emissions or increase our uptake, then we could think about getting paid for that. And so soil carbon is really hard to measure. And I talked about how it's patchy. And so it's current carbon payments don't seem to offset the cost of doing the management or the cost of measuring the soil carbon. We've been thinking about ways to reduce our cattle methane, and that might be a way that's really easy to measure because you can measure the additives that you give cattle. But I think we need to do more work to understand how effective the additives are and if they can be given in a logistically feasible way in pasture-based systems. But I think it's important to think about these things, and payments for ecosystem services can help ranchers help the economic situation. And in Florida, at least, things that help keep ranchers ranching, keeping them economically viable, is really good for conservation.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And unfortunately, we ran out of time to get to all of the questions. Some of those remained unanswered. But thank you for the presentation and for your thoughtful answers to the questions. This was really great. I'd like to remind everyone that a recording of this presentation will be posted on the website, our Climate Hub's LTAR website, webinars, series website. Please also plan to join us for our next webinar, scheduled for August the 19th at this same time. Dr. Alan Franslubers will be talking about, can soil organic matter really be changed on grazing lands in North Carolina? And thank you so much. We hope to see you then.